Now, I'll just give a little introduction to Adrian. Adrian began campaigning to save Victorian forests from the age of 16, being a key player in saving the Otways. In 2003, he switched his focus from forest to reversing global warming post the 2003 European heatwave. In 2005, Adrian stopped the Naas Valley being flooded in the ACT, and in 2006, he established Beyond Zero Emissions, a world-leading solution-orientated think tank. In 2013, Adrian began campaigning to get local governments to respond to global warming as an emergency. And in 2016, he was a key player in getting the first government in the world to acknowledge we face a climate emergency. Today, Adrian continues to work on getting the local government to act on global warming in an emergency mode through CACE, which stands for Council and Community Action in the Climate Emergency. Dale Martin is a passionate, dedicated professional with extensive experience in a diverse range of roles and organisations in the private and government sectors. He served as councillor for the North West Ward of Moreland City Council from 2016 to 2020 and was the former chair of the Urban Planning Committee and councillor responsible for infrastructure, waste transition, sustainability and youth. He is a former board member of the Australian Energy Foundation and co-founder of the campaign Plastic Bag Free Victoria. Dale is the author of the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit to help councillors, council and community get meaningful climate action at local government level.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone there. And very sorry I couldn't be in person. Although flying in, we got stuck down here in Victoria, which is very sad. Anyway, so today we're here to talk about Climate Emergency Declaration Hype or Hope. So I'm just from CACE. That's just our website. If you're interested in looking us up online, I'll refer to the website a couple of times during the talk. So today we're here to talk about the Climate Emergency Declaration Hype or Hope, and a bit of the context is that, of course, COVID's sort of not climate campaigning for a six in many ways. So it's taken the focus off it, makes it more difficult to campaign. And we need to find some way of getting everyone excited about it again. So very quickly, how bad is global warming? It's important to bring up. It's probably useful just for a quick refresher. And also, if you're talking to local councillors, you'll need to sort of think of some different ways you can talk about this. But obviously, we're seeing record-breaking, never before seen events. The fires that we had in 2019, coastal erosion occurring in Australia and all around the world. We have fires currently in America and the floods in Europe. And the floods in 2002 was one of the two trigger events that got me into the campaigning on climate change in the first place. And also ecology in many areas is in free fall collapse. So something like the Great Barrier Reef at 1 degree of warming is now bleaching faster than it can heal. So unless we actually get a global cooling, i.e. cool the planet less than 1 degree, we lose the Great Barrier Reef. So it's the sort of the enormity of the task that we face at the moment. Another big issue that we face is that a whole series of amplifying feedbacks, which we call positive feedback loops, that accelerate climate change from a sort of natural focus, such as the Arctic ice in the North Pole that notionally reflects summer Arctic ice, reflecting that sunlight back out into space, oxidization of peatlands, melting permafrost, Amazon rainforest becoming a net carbon emitter, etc. Pretty much all of these systems are now committed to adding more warming to the planet, and if we don't get a cooling, they'll keep pushing temperatures higher and higher and adding to what humans are doing as well, although we've triggered it, of course. When I recently spoke at the Sunshine Coast Council, I was invited to speak there with a couple of other speakers. One was Will Stephan, and he's quite a well-known climate scientist based at the ANU. And his comment to the Sunshine Coast councillors was, we're facing the fastest rise in CO2 and temperature other than when the big meteorite hit. And so that's basically the entirety of Earth history. So 4 billion years, this is the fastest time we've seen CO2 and temperature rise other than when the big meteorite hit that killed the dinosaurs. And he called it a planetary emergency. The big problem we've got is that we talk about stopping temperature rise at 1.5 as our ideal goal, but definitely not higher than 2. If we look at the Paris commitments that have been made, that will take us to somewhere around 3 degrees. And if we look at what the governments are actually going to implement of those commitments, we'll end up going to somewhere above 3, possibly 4 or more degrees. The problem there is, of course, is once you get above 4 degrees, it's incompatible with organised global community. It's literally the Mad Max. Literally the Mad Max scenario that we face. Once we hit 3 degrees, you're sort of talking collapses of regions and states, millions of people starving, and mass migration of refugees. And we don't want to go above 2 degrees either. So the 2 degrees threshold is the extremely dangerous boundary. When Will Steffen was asked, what about above 2 degrees by the Sunshine Coast councillors, he said, we just do not go there. And he just wouldn't answer the question. And of course, everything that we're seeing now is occurring just above 1 degrees. So just on the way, sort of to highlight some of the issues around the temperature rise, ecology pretty much collapses at 2 degrees in Australian context. The map on the green is sort of the natural fire regimes. Different types of forests or woodlands or grasslands have different natural rates of fire. If we go to 2 degrees, that's the image on the right, you can see that the intervals between the various fires for the different ecosystems changes dramatically. So it doesn't really matter if you're a grassland or a woodland or a forest. The change in fire regimes will be so severe that it will simplify and probably, destroy most of the ecology of any particular area within the ACT, and that's just one example. We're probably looking at facing a global food shortage at some point. This is a sort of study that came out of the UK. The UK only makes between 50 to 75% of its food calories, depending on which sort of way you look at it. So sometime before 2070, it could be a few years' time, it could be 10 years' time, might be 20 years' time, but sometime before 2070, we end up with a global food crisis where there's simply not enough food to eat for the world. And the consequence of that, even for a country like England, because there simply won't be food available on the international market to buy, will be quite disastrous. If you want to understand the sort of temperature by degree by degree sort of impacts, there's a really good book called 6 Degrees by Mark Linus. I read it ages ago, and it's a pretty scary read. You read chapter 1, which is 1 degrees. You don't want to read chapter 2. He's just put out a new one. I haven't read it. When I saw it today, I ordered it, so I'll read it next week. But chase out that book for a good reference on that. And finally, just on how bad global warming is, we know we don't want to go past 2 degrees, but this sort of graph sort of highlights that in some ways we are literally already there. So if we have a look at this, we've got pre-industrial temperatures at baseline of 0. We add 400 parts carbon, bringing with the other gases up to 485 equivalent. At equilibrium, that's 2.4 degrees of warming. So at current, and this is slides a few years old now, so the levels are higher than this. But when it all settles out, it's 2.4 degrees of warming. We've got 1 point, it's higher than that now, maybe 1.1 realised warming. There's a sort of slowness in the warming that's associated with ocean temperature sort of stabilisation sort of thing, where the oceans take up some of the heat. But really importantly, there's this factor up here called aerosol cooling, where about a degree's worth of warming is being reflected back out into space by the pollution from coal plants and heavy industry. And if we shut all of those, if I click my fingers and shut those coal plants and heavy polluting industries down overnight, in about 2 to 3 weeks, that aerosol comes out of atmosphere, and we would see on average a jump of 1 degree, bringing us to above 2 degrees right now, like in a matter of weeks, if we manage to shut them down quickly. So it's pretty bad, but there's, on the good news side, every single technical issue pretty much is solved. So a group I set up quite a few years ago called Beyond Zero Emissions started with solving the issue around 100% renewable energy for Australia at emergency speed, 10-year transition or less. Since then, it's worked on buildings, surface transport, agriculture, low emissions concrete, drawdown, etc. It and lots of other universities and institutions have pretty much developed every single solution we need. We're still working on negative emissions concrete. And I used to say, we didn't have zero emissions flight, but the last time I spoke up at the Sunshine Coast, a couple of people spoke to me after and said, no, there's zero emission electric planes flying in Canada as tourist planes, and someone's just done a biofuel flight across the English Channel, etc. So maybe by the time COVID's finished and everyone's flying again, who knows? Not that it's necessarily a good thing, but potentially there'll be zero emission flight as well. So it can obviously do things around consumption. We know logging native forest releases hundreds of tons of CO2 per hectare. A lot of that in Victoria is driven by producing wood chip for paper, such as reflex products. It's a simple choice not to do it. We know methane is a really huge contributor to global warming, and diet is one of the easiest things we can change. However, one of the big problems is that, within something like the Beyond Zero Emissions, Zero Carbon Stationary Energy Plan, there might be 1,000 campaigns in there if you broke it apart. And we just don't have the resources all the time to win 1,000 campaigns that each might take a year or 2 or 3, and you may not even win them. So the problem is we need to actually focus on systems change, not incremental change. We need to win everything at once, and we need to do it really quickly. So how do we do that? So, as my partner likes quoting Bill McKibben when he says, winning slowly means losing. So we don't want to win slowly, that's for sure. All right, so we need a way to accelerate change. Where we've come at it from is around the whole concept of emergency action. So what we've been working on is framing climate change as climate emergency and getting our government to respond in emergency mode. Because the bottom line is that if we're going to get out of this without a significant disaster, all 3 tiers of government, state, local and federal, need to respond effectively in emergency mode, is effectively in emergency mode so that we can actually, get out of this problem, right? So we're going to have to get there. We're going to have to get there as soon as possible. And how do we get there is the question. All right, so one reason we chose emergency mode, because in sort of acute emergency, short-term emergency, such as fires and floods and cyclones and things, Australia tends to respond really well to them. And people understand that frame of response, and state governments at least know how to work it. So this is a Victorian example where all these people involved in planning for severe bushfires, we go and resource all the different first responders, and then we communicate how to the community both threat and how to prepare. So we know what to do with emergencies, and it's a model that we can adopt. Unfortunately, COVID has shown that for more complex emergencies and emergencies that are sort of slow and wavering in nature and not so immediate, that there's a lot of mistakes that just keep getting made again and again. So, and it's slightly worrying for climate change, because the politicians, hopefully not, but the politicians in charge of the COVID responses are the same ones, in fact, doing the climate responses. So a little bit of history about the campaign. Can I just have a thumbs up? Is the sound going good there for the people in the room? Can you hear me? Yeah, great, thank you. So the history, pretty much the first sort of climate emergency campaigning framing was Al Gore back in his Inconvenient Truth sort of work, and he called it, we need to sort of respond to climate change as if we're facing the Nazis in World War II, and called it a global emergency. Then in 2008, David Spratt and Philip Sutton, 2 campaigners from Victoria that I know fairly well, wrote a seminal work called Climate Code Red, the case for emergency action, and that's one of the first fully emergency framed climate focused sort of books, etc. In 2013, myself and a number of other people, including Philip Sutton, started focusing on emergency plans campaigns for councils. And our idea was, we had the highs of Kevin 07, where, climate change was the greatest moral challenge of our time, etc., and all the good stuff. But when that all dropped away, we were saying, well, we're getting real trouble getting traction at state and federal. What can we do? And we thought, focusing on councils somewhere in Australia, we would get a council that can act. And the logic of it sort of goes that, councils are often less political, not always. They're much more connected to their community. And a lot of councils have nothing to do with fossil fuel industries, which was the main drag on the sort of climate stuff, and still is today. In 2016, a bunch of people formed this organisation, Climate Emergency Declaration. They were focused on getting climate emergency declarations on state and federal parties, but we encouraged them. There was a council election in Victoria in 2016, and we said, let's bring this down to council level, and they agreed to do that. They supported us, and we worked with them. And basically, one of the strategies was to go around to as many candidates as possible and get them to sign declarations saying that they would declare a climate emergency and act in an emergency way if they got elected. And there's a whole bunch of candidates doing that there in that election. So in Darebin, where I live, we focused our campaign, and we did all the usual stuff: leafleting, community meeting, signs. We ran candidates in as many wards as we could, and we had one-on-one discussions with the other candidates. and lobbying, etc. And then the result of that was on December the 5th in 2016, the first government in the world acknowledged that we're in a climate emergency. And there they are there, the Darebin councillors. They're a really nice bunch of people. One's missing, a bit sick, but they acknowledged as the first motion of the newly elected council in response to the community pressure and requests that we've been putting on them. And before I go into some of the detailed posts, I just want to acknowledge Sadamia. This is a thing set up by Philip Sutton and Margaret Hender. Margaret's been doing most of the work recently. Behind it's pretty much a one-person show maintaining a sort of international register of all the climate emergency declarations. And she doesn't commit full-time to this as a volunteer. We just wouldn't have this sort of data to show you next. But since then, you know, we've seen this. It was a couple of year delay before it took off. We had one council declare in February of the next year, Yarra, following Darebin's lead. Then Bryony was working on a number of councils in WA, managed to get Vincent to declare. We had a phone hookup with a bunch of American campaigners. They started working in America and they got Hoboken and Montgomery, and then they got Los Angeles. And once we got Los Angeles, it became a thing. Los Angeles has got 5 million people and it sort of took off around the world, but it took a couple of years to get going. And there's a picture of it starting to take off in 2018. And then here's a picture which is more current with all the declarations, and some of them are states as well as councils. So since then, there's a grand total of 1,998 governments around the world that have declared. I didn't update the bottom figures, they're a bit hard to pull out, but there's around 1,900 councils, 35 states, 15 countries, and the EU. And a whole lot of other organisations have declared along the way in support of local climate emergency declarations by council or state government or national government. They've included schools and businesses and community groups and environment groups, et cetera, and large organisations, including the Catholic Church, for example. In Australia, 102 out of the 537 or 20% of the councils have declared, and in Queensland, 1, which is Noosa so far. So what is the CED for local government? It simply is a formal motion of council that is passed with 2 key elements. Part 1 acknowledges the climate emergency, and part 2 is a commitment to act. That's all it is. Here's the original text of the very first one done in the world, and it reads, Council, this is the Darebin one in 2016, Council recognises that we are in a state of climate emergency that requires urgent action by all levels of government, including by local councils, and that's all it needs to be. Now, in some countries, Americans in particular, do ones that are literally like 15 pages long. And we discussed this on the CACE website, so you guys are hopefully looking to get Moreton Bay to do this, so you might want to have a look at this page on our website that unpacks the sort of issues around climate emergency declarations, longer, shorter, that sort of thing. So there's a bit of a resource there, and happy to discuss it with you. So why do CEDs matter? Like why do we bother? Well, for starters, we've changed global discourse. So basically, unpaid volunteer campaigners working at grassroots levels have changed the way that we speak around global warming by getting these declarations moving around the globe. And the good thing about that is that it actually helps drive action. So Jane Morton, a climate activist in Melbourne, in Darebin as well, psychologist, wrote this wonderful piece of work, Don't Mention the Emergency. Emergency framing was opposed and still is opposed by some NGOs because they feel that it doesn't work or puts people off. But Jane is a psychologist. She looked into the actual science behind it. We use emergency communication in real, like immediate acute emergencies, for example, and it works. So if you just Google Don't Mention the Emergency by Jane Morton, and if you want to read more about that. So why do it? Like, it drives action basically, and look, and all of these things that you see here, these all save a council money. So if you're a liberal, conservative, money orientated, let's pay less rates person, you would literally do all of these. And these include bulk purchasing of renewable energy by councils, including switching most of your fleet across to electric vehicles, switching out all your street lights to LEDs, not mercury vapors or high pressure sodiums. Apparently it's a bit difficult in Queensland because you've got a state monopoly that isn't that much into it, as far as I understand. And some councils take green waste and turn it into biochar, all of it saving council money. Sometimes it's about loaning money to the members of your community for people who can't afford the upfront cost of solar or energy efficiency, for example. This lady's received a loan from Darebin for solar panels. She saves money on her power bill and she pays it back through rates. So it's a great way of getting mitigation and money-saving technology into people's homes. Sometimes about where councils put their money, and simply their super contracts or where they hold their money in a bank is enough to, sway a bank whether or not to back Adani, for example. The threat of moving a bank account away was what some councils did around the Adani campaign. And sometimes it creates award-winning leading stuff. So the Climate Council got into the local government space after we sort of kicked it off with the Cities Power Partnership, and they give awards and encourage excellence and that sort of thing. And sometimes it's about spending money. So, councils acknowledge the threats of climate change after declaring a climate emergency, might work to stabilise beaches or protect rare communities. But, how long can we do this for if we don't reverse global warming? Eventually, areas like this will be inundated and lost. So I'm now going to hand to Dale, and Dale has done a wonderful piece of work called the Local Government and Climate Emergency Toolkit. And it's a toolkit designed for community members, councillors, but can also be used by staff. And it really unpacks the sort of things you can do at local government in a really succinct and clever way, and how to get that happening at local government. So I'll hand to Dale.
Cool. All right. G'day, everyone. My name's Dale Martin. So I'm a former councillor in the city of Moreland. I was elected in 2016 and finished up in 2020. And essentially, I created the Local Government Climate Emergency Toolkit as really almost a bit of a library for a lot of the research and a lot of the work that I did over the 4 years in Moreland. As one of the things that I found as a councillor, really wanting to document everything that I was doing, because I was getting a lot of questions from other councillors in other cities. And I thought that this was just a really good way to finish my term and really share a lot of my key learnings. So, like I said, I was councillor for 4 years, voted on about 1,300 reports. Of that, I made about 100 amendments, moved about 30 notices of motion, and pretty much all of it required negotiation. And one of the things with local government is that, there's some areas that tend to vote along party lines, but for a lot of the issues, a lot of the different individual councillors will vote in line with their belief system, even if it sits outside of that party line. So it's really important to really clearly articulate a lot of the issues and a lot of the experiences. They're talking with a lot of members in the community, and so a lot of the work that I did really did require me to bring everyone on board. Also, what I've included in the toolkit is a lot of the community advocacy work that I did. We ran a campaign, Plastic Bag Free Victoria, which actually worked with a lot of the East Coast advocacy groups in advocating for the plastic bag ban. And now we're seeing a lot of the single-use plastics bans rolling out from that work as well. So what I wanted to do was to really make the process more accessible. I really wanted to articulate why local governments. It's something that a lot of people raised with me. I mean, for one, a lot of people don't really understand what local governments do, let alone know that there's hundreds of billions of dollars of assets under management, and multi-million-dollar budgets each year. I wanted to articulate the decision makers, looking at the key documents, and these key documents, they change. They're worded slightly differently in each state. But if you have a look at the toolkit, you'll see which ones are relevant to yourselves up in Queensland. The really important thing that I set out to achieve was really having specific and measurable recommendations with timeframes. Really, when you think about it, we're working to 2030, and we really need to get to net negative emissions really as quickly as possible. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing with a lot of emergency declarations and a lot of things that councils are putting up is that they don't have those timeframes. And so you get a lot of lovely wording, but actually there's nothing measurable that comes with it. And I also include some examples. So really the need for it is that you'll find, and I don't know if there's any councillors out there or if anyone has really sat down with any of the councillors in your area, but councillors are incredibly time poor. And there's so many things, there's so many people that want your attention, there's so much stuff happening. And so really, if you can put your argument together, be really concise, and actually provide them with an option, and if you can provide a cost or anything like that to that also, just makes it easier. It gives a greater chance of success. All the councils operate differently. Like I said, there's different wording for different things, but naturally, if the community is demanding something, that the councillors will respond to what their community is saying. Also, the system is incredibly complex. And, it took me probably 2 or 3 years to get my head around just all the functions and all the different areas of the council. So one of the things that I'm consistently asked is what do I include? Where do I target my energy? Council's about to declare a climate emergency, or it hasn't done that yet, but I want the council to take greater action. What do I do? So in the toolkit, I've highlighted across 7 key areas. And really, this is trying to get community, get councils, get councillors thinking a little bit more laterally. We're not talking about just, going 100% renewable energy power purchase agreement or getting everyone into EVs. It's much, much broader than that. You can look at things in the energy space, the transport space, talking about your communication, how you communicate with your residents. Procurement is incredibly important, where you spend your money as a council. And this is, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars each year is hugely important. Talking about divestment, talking about the built environment, looking at planning schemes, looking at land management, looking at your local laws, and there's really also exploring things like transparency, accountability. Are you looking at risk? Are you looking at procurement? All of these different areas fall within local government remit, and they're all areas that you can tackle to address the climate emergency. So again, this is just a sample from my toolkit on my website, so lgcet.com. You can download the full version of the toolkit, or you can download a Word document summary, which I've included there to make it a little bit easier for people to just copy and paste directly. So whether that's into emails or other things. As you'll see, I've got the sections there, the transport, the recommendations, and then I've got an example of something that I actually implemented as a councillor. So again, the website is lgcet.com. You can go there, the toolkit's free. You can download the full version, or you can download the summary version on the website. Also, if you've got any questions or you want any follow-ups, feel free to send me an email at info@lgcet.com. Cheers.
Thanks, Dale. Great. I'll just jump back in then. And okay, so Dale's work really unpacks everything that a council can do pretty much. A second edition's coming out that picks up anything that Dale's missed, and it's just an excellent toolkit that you can use and encourage your council to use as well. So, one possible thing you can consider if you don't get a climate emergency is you can sort of try and say, well, we didn't get the declaration, but we got this amazing project that helps encourage everything along. Just to sort of think about what councils can do in a slightly different way. CACE likes to think about it from this sort of idea of upwards, downwards, sideways and inwards. And basically what we're trying to do is get councils to think, if they do declare, pretty much the first thing they've got to do is focus inwards, look at declaring a climate emergency, reviewing what they do, getting the CEO, the management and the middle management teams, executive management all on side, educating their staff. They can get people like me, Dale, etc., other people who are risk experts to go and talk to their staff and their management to do that. Downward is all the community focused work, whether it's public education or mitigation work or resilience work, that's all a part of it. Sideways is getting other councils to act. That's really important. Most people, 40% of people won't act unless they see it in their peers. Their peers are doing it. So people are basically herd animals, and so getting a council to start doing things tends to get other councils following. So we see that again and again in our work. And ultimately, we get councils putting pressure upwards on higher levels of government, and councils put pressure on governments all the time to get them to do things they want. So Questions and issues that come up around climate emergency declaration. One, we get asked, particularly by council laws, saying, hey, you know, can we legally do this, et cetera, et cetera. The bottom line is you can. It's not a formal state of emergency declaration in law. That's done by states in Australia. If in New Zealand, councils can do that. But here it's symbolic of a state of emergency declaration. But what you're saying is that this is a really important issue and we can go into emergency mode. Can councils go into emergency mode? Haven't really talked about that. That's pretty much the next step after the declaration when you're genuinely taking it seriously, like an emergency, where you suspend business as usual, you meet your core service requirements and core deliverables from your council, but with all your extra resources, you focus that in around reversing global warming. So can they do that? And pretty much under every state, under the enabling legislation of councils, there is somewhere a line that actually enables that. And for example, in Queensland, it says a councillor must represent the current and future interests of the residents of a local government area. And clearly, climate change is impacting on us in the future, and you know, councillors simply must take that on board when they act. And when I spoke to Sunshine Coast Council, the speaker who spoke after me, Donovan, gave a sort of 20-minute speech around how if any council starts making decisions and not taking climate change into account, councillors, in particularly in Queensland, where they can be personally liable for their decisions. So it does have real world impacts, and that sort of thing is something you might consider getting your Moreton Bay councillors to get a risk expert such as Donovan and a few other people who do it, having a frank discussion with about how much risk they will be exposed to if they don't take climate change seriously. In terms of freedom of action, local governments pretty much can do anything in Queensland. That's what the legislation says. It's probably the best one in Australia. Sometimes what we see in the council is a push by usually people from the Liberal National Party to change the declaration to use the word crisis. Now, language matters. Emergency is stronger than crisis for a range of reasons. And it also means if you use the word crisis, it doesn't get counted as a formal declaration. So that's been a tactic we've seen a few times. Left versus right, this really shouldn't be an issue. The right and both the right and the left have got strong influences, the fossil fuel industries and other sort of climate change dependent type, you know, lobby groups, etc. It shouldn't be an issue between left and right, but sadly it is. So what are we doing wrong? Where does it go wrong when people declare? Currently, I call it a silent emergency. So I can't remember which lockdown it was, but I decided to look at every council's website to see how many of them that had declared had climate emergency on their front page. And only 2 did out of the almost 90 at the time. So I call that a silent emergency. Emergencies aren't silent things. We need councils to put on the front page of the website, that sort of thing. You know, and here's an example from your council with coronavirus. This is the sort of thing we want to see around the climate emergency. But that's how the page came up when I loaded it for the first time on my desktop browser. So a third of the page dedicated coronavirus, and other councils have more and some less. But that's the sort of thing we could see. And in terms of loud and proud, here's the pink one's a climate emergency banner on the city of Yarra, for example, in Melbourne. One really important thing is don't reinforce inadequate goals. The net zero target of 2050 is completely inadequate. It's literally suicidal. And so don't declare an emergency and say we've got 30 years to get to zero. That's something we don't like to see. So what happens after a CED, other than all the projects you can implement? Now, I want to say here that councils won't have the money to do everything. They'll have to pick a few projects, and one of them should be a community outreach project that tries to get a climate emergency message to all of the community. But when they're in full emergency mode, we discuss this on the CACE website. So if you want to explore that a little bit more, that's further down the track for you guys, but you can have a look at it there. And you might want to do something like what Hepburn has done, which is literally looking at pretty much every single emission source in their council and trying to find a way to hit that to zero. But to get there, you're going to have a whole thing, a whole series of things lined up. At the moment, you need a super majority of councils, a CEO that's going to back it, good climate and communications team, a council with functioning systems, and a strong community campaign. And you need that, in your case, just for a climate emergency declaration. So your council, there they all are. They've all got phone numbers. They've all got emails. A lot of them have got mobile phone numbers, not all though. They all represent single member wards. They've all got values that you could do some research about. When communicating with people, the short answer is, do your values matter? Not really. It's what they care about. So you need to find out what these people care about and how that relates to climate change, and then talk to them about how climate change impacts what they care about. The default one you usually use is family. Most people care about their family. On the CACE website, it's, we gave an example of what we did in Darebin, but there's pages of campaign instructions on how to go about a basic campaign to get your council to declare or into emergency mode. So take a look at that, and I'm very happy to talk to people about that. Some basic campaign tips before we finish, and then on to questions. Something that you guys might want to consider, obviously, is a good Facebook page, a network of people or groups in your area that are backing a climate emergency declaration. This is the example of the Sunshine Coast one that does that. You also want to communicate to people using values and identities and things that they share with. Like, if you play football, go and talk to your football team. If you're into car sports, talk to the car sports people, because pretty much the majority of people are motivated to change by what their peers do. And here's a councillor from the Blue Mountains, Brent Hoare, who's a climate emergency supporter, but he's dressed up in his Rural Fire Service gear so he can appeal to a broader cross-section of his community, say, than he might otherwise. So it's a clever way of campaigning. Always when you're campaigning, you're trying to give your people you're campaigning with a sort of an escape route, a solution that helps them and helps you. You try not to sort of put people's backs against the wall, otherwise they get agitated and push back. And I've got this here because, you literally might be talking to people who don't understand what climate change is. And I use this diagram to explain climate change to kids as young as grade 4 or 5 when I teach at schools and things. And, it's about blankets. It's about the earth freezing if it doesn't have blankets. And if you put more blankets on, it gets really hot. And you might literally need to explain global warming in this sort of simple metaphors to some of your councillors. And there's another bottom line: about 1 in 10 people probably aren't working with. And I've just picked 2 random people here, and I'm not sure if they're going to, be worth putting in the effort. And, so I'll probably leave it there and throw over to questions. I hope people got a pretty fast and furious overview of the whole thing.
Well, thank you, Adrian and Dale. Just checking, can you hear me at this level of speaking?
I can hear you, yeah.
Good. Okay, that's just illustrating to everybody in the room.
I can also hear you, and I've also got my mic down around my mouth this time round. So apologies, everyone, for that.
Well, I think thank you very much for that. Just to reiterate that the evening is being recorded, so we'll have all this information to review over. I think it's going to be shared on YouTube. Is that right, Adrian?
Yeah, I'll pop it up on YouTube and there'll be a link on the CACE website.
Well, we've got now a good time where we can bring forward some questions, some initial questions. Personally, the point was made about emergency or crisis. I think the way we verbally describe things is very, very important. The word emergency is very, very different to crisis. Emergency, it just gives a license to disrupt. And I think that's a very important thing going forward. One opportunity we've got with Moreton Bay region is the recent Moreton Says survey, which follows on from the new mayor. Is it 2 or 3 years, this ongoing consultation, where the council is insisting that they want to listen to systems? So I think, if we could frame the future going forward with that survey around what we say is we want to declare a climate change. We've got an appetite as citizens in Moreton Bay for there to be a climate emergency declaration. How do we best start that going, really? Yeah, well, this is just our first initial, it's our very first gathering in Moreton Bay region. It's a real start. Where do we go from now? I mean, think firstly we want to decide if we want to have a follow-up meeting. Do we want to have a petition? I've drafted up an initial idea of how that could be framed around the Moreton State theme from the Moreton State survey, which is proceeding over the next 2 or 3 years. Any thoughts on that?
So, clearly, something you'd want to do from tonight would be to get a list of names of everyone who's interested, have a second meeting, decide what sort of campaign stuff that you're going to be doing. Things like petitions are good and valuable, but they're easily it's a really good way to do community outreach, actually. So they probably have as much value as a community outreach tool and getting people interested in the campaign, ultimately, as an actual tool to convince councillors to do something. Dale might want to talk more to this, but from the feedback we hear from numerous councillors is that they just don't hear about people talking about climate emergency, and consequently, petitions tend to get, rightly or wrongly, sort of assumed to be sort of like one thing almost. And what you really want is people to be ringing up councillors or emailing councillors and hassling them. And Dale, you had some really good anecdotes about that in past talks.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, one of the things that, so as a councillor, you probably, if you're engaging with your constituents and you're pretty active in the community, you're probably getting anywhere from 200, 300, 400 emails a week. And they're on every single topic under the sun, and most of it is probably not even under your jurisdiction. It's probably at a state or a federal level, and so you're sort of channeling things to people in different areas. But a petition is a great way to really get to know who's interested, what sort of numbers. But at the end of the day, what you really need to do, and what is most effective, is those one-on-one conversations with your councillors. If I was a councillor and I was getting pro forma kind of letters where people had just changed the name out and had the same letter 100 times, it is quite frustrating. But if I had 10 people or a handful of people give me a call over the space of a week saying, listen, I'm really passionate about this. We've actually got a community group together. We've all sat down. We've actually got a couple of things that we think you should look at to start with. And this is how you might go about doing it. I find that that's probably much more effective in getting your message across. That being said, that does require councillors to be receptive. And like Adrian said, there's some councillors that probably just won't be receptive to any sort of communication, or would be impossible to track down. So for those councillors, I think petitions might be good to catch, but it really comes down to trying to understand who your councillors are, and try and get to understand what the organisation's already doing. Because if your council's already running off and doing a heap of things, then that's an easy redirect for councillors, and you're probably not going to see any greater level of action. So yeah, there's a couple of things in there. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. I was just mentioning that Moreton Bay Council actually have about 20 or 30-year development plan. What I came across, and you can easily find it on with a quick Google search, is actually Moreton Bay 2050, and at the moment they expecting Moreton Bay population going up, tenfold, and they planning road developments. They destroying habitats, and it's quite sad to to watch. But I'm wondering, is there anything we can do to make changes into those 20, 30 years plans that you, Dale, probably know as a council? They don't plan 5 years ahead. They make quite substantial plans ahead, and I'm wondering if anything can be done with those plans.
So I would typically, I mean, I would say that, you know, while having a 10-year, a 20-year, a 30-year vision or plan are great to have, I would say that what your council is actually interested in delivering would sit within probably what they're voting on as part of the budget. So you'll find that the budget is probably a 1-year annual budget with maybe a 5-year capital works budget. And that would be sort of the key things that I would be looking at to target if I was a community member. If you can get pilots, if you can get programs, if you can get actions into that that whatever that time horizon is in that budget, then that's where you'll start to see the benefit. While they might have a 20-year plan, I mean, any of those sort of things, it's very reasonable that a new council could review or could update that. They may even be able to amend it to include certain things. So I think it's very reasonable to expect that, you know, a document is not written once and then for the next 20 years or 30 years it's followed through. I think as a community, you should be looking at the budgets and the budget time horizons, and those would be the things that the time horizon that I'd be working towards as a community member.
Yeah,
Often you are dealing with the levels of government, and some would pertain to local government and some would pertain to state governments if you're trying to change documents. Now, what she said is exactly right, because a couple of things that didn't come up in there, the population, and that governs everything, no matter what. And I mean, I've been here over 50 years in this area, and the amount of population that you have seen and the projected population for this area, that photo that you had up of Moreton Bay is not what's here. Now, you would rarely see that around. In my area at Mount Sampson, we are the only landholder now. All the rest of it is gone. It's under housing. So if you take the coast of Eastern Australia, it's all the arable land is going under housing. And that is not sustainable. If you're looking at the use of resources like water, you've had lights up there. If you take the lighting of cities and the amount of power that it takes to do that, all of those things cost somebody. So the costs that we are imposing on our land have got to be looked at by all the levels of government. It's no use talking about all these other things and not doing something about population.
So it's the councils, I mean, the issue of population, like one of the worst spots to put anywhere in someone additional in the world is Victoria, because we have brown coal down where we are. So our emissions per capita are higher than almost anywhere, unless you sort of look at the sort of Kuwait and those sort of oil-based countries. So we're in ecological overshoot now. So we've done so much damage to our planet. We have a sort of a Ponzi scheme of an economy in one part and a mine in the other part of our economy, and it's based on, you know, constant expansion of population that drives, you know, the building, et cetera, industries. And it has to get to a point where we need to push back and say that this is not ever expanding population based, ever expanding material consumption is no longer a part of the world that can be sustainable. So you can incorporate that in your campaigning, and part of campaigning when we campaign out in the community is exposing people to all of these issues that are not discussed in mainstream, or even in some mainstream or progressive political parties won't touch population or whatever. And you can use them to raise awareness. But if you don't raise awareness, if you don't get people on side, then, you know, we just languish as a tiny minority of people, you know, which aren't which won't have any impact. But in saying that, you know, like every single thing matters. You know, we've had councils, people starting climate declaration campaigns in councils and then being rung by the council officers and say, we have got a climate petition. I've been here for 20 years and we have never had a single petition on the environment from anyone on any issue ever. Does that make sense? So everything you do matters. And although it's a long, hard slog, ultimately, the sad reality is that the climate change will get worse and worse and worse, and eventually it will just become impossible to ignore. So the question is at that point, we're trying to drag back the point when our governments take it seriously and start actually acting to reverse global warming. Because even these 2050 targets, like, you know, can you imagine 30 to 60 more years of increasing floods, firestorms, sea level rise, species extinction, et cetera, coastal erosion? Like, it just, at the rate it's getting worse and worse, we just don't come out the other side. So, yeah. So whenever we campaign, we always treat, ultimately, even if we're unsuccessful and say the big objective, it's about getting the message out to as much of the community as possible. But that can be hard work. So we, in Darebin, we did public meetings around climate emergency declaration, suburb by suburb, and leafleted every suburb. And instead of leafleting, the gold standard would be to door knock, for example. So, anyway. And has anyone got any more questions?
Yeah, Adrian, just going on from that, on population projections, any advice on how we research into population projections that council use for their long-term planning? Because clearly that's what drives their development and is going to cause the problems with climate change increasingly, is the huge amount of population growth that they claim is going to be required to be catered for.
Dale, can you...
Yeah, so I mean, so my understanding of population growth was determined largely from data collected through ABS and through, you know, things like the census and those sort of things. That's how we did a lot of our population planning. I mean, back when I was in the city of Moreland, I think we were 170,000 people, projected to grow to over 200,000 within the next couple of years. Most of that was really, you know, sort of inner city, dense, multi-level sort of apartment buildings and those sort of things. And, you know, one of the concerns from a lot of residents that sort of I came across quite a bit was that, you know, these awful towers were going up and, you know, there were people just being crammed in like sardines on top of each other. And so one of the things that we were able to put in place was actually a lot of revisions to our planning scheme. And the planning scheme is something that's key here, because if you're able to build better quality buildings with, you know, passive design, if you're looking at actual trying to achieve, you know, highly energy efficient buildings, some of these things can actually act as a density or form of density control. And that might be a way that you can use, you know, what's under the remit of local government or lobbying at a state level to actually influence the density. I think it's a very, very difficult thing to, you know, challenge council on the population growth, because really at the end of the day, the population growth will depend on the supply of housing that's going up, the rezonings, all of those sort of things, and that sits firmly within sort of the planning space and the planning scheme. So if you're able to put some mitigation measures in there, I think you'll probably get a much better outcome.
So if anyone wants to ask questions from the Zoom, sorry, someone just did as I said it.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I think I'm right in saying that Australia has the largest house size, average size of house in the world.
So is it, I can't, sorry, I've got to get my, the gentleman who's wanting to ask a question on Zoom, can you go ahead, please?
Yeah, sure, yes. It's Les Barkley from Pristine Peninsula, a group on the Redcliffe Peninsula. So we're going to have a 34% population growth by 2041. That's what our council's predicted. You may have said that before. I couldn't hear something, so forgive me if it was mentioned. And they're expecting 88,000 new homes by 2030, I think it is. So we've got the, this is more a statement that I think we could possibly see if we could leverage off this. We've got the 2032 Olympics to be announced for Brisbane, South East Queensland tomorrow, potentially. So hopefully, so I believe that we've got that as a leverage where we can actually put the pressure on, maybe not this council, but perhaps the second term of this council to actually look at climate change emergency within their second term, putting pressure on them in leading up to the 2032 Olympics, because I think Olympics are actually becoming more green, I suppose. 2020, Tokyo's showing itself to be quite a green Olympics, so it's got its other issues, of course. But so I think by 2032, I think the pressure will be on for councils to be shown to be actually towing the line, so to speak.
Anyone else got a quick? Someone's got a hand up, have they? Yeah, please.
Hi. Yeah, I'm actually just about to go up to Ellie Beach for the Great Barrier Reef Festival. And I was just doing a little bit of community mapping and research up there. And it was quite disheartening to realize the extent of denial and just what you were saying before about, some MPs or councillors are not worth talking to. I mean, it seems like a radical action up there would just be to show a David Attenborough documentary or something like that. But do you have any tips for talking to kind of deeply entrenched coal seats? I mean, I've heard that it's good to talk about jobs and focus on like, how we need to move towards clean energy and stuff like that. But yeah, any tips for because I mean, if only one council area in Queensland has declared, we really need to kind of figure out techniques for getting all the other ones in Queensland to step up, or maybe not even go after councillors, but do more, door knocking and stuff. I don't know. Just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Look, it's ultimately linking climate change to things people value. So one thing that's happening now is that there's a clear, the European Union's, intention to put trade sanctions on Australia means that, our commitment to be a highly polluting country, etc., is just a dead end, damaging decision that's going to actually backfire on farmers and eventually, coal communities that have not transitioned. But it's about, the conversation, what you want to do is that way out concept. So I'll just use the Adani phrase as an example of probably how not to campaign. You say stop Adani, but you should never say stop Adani. It's stop Adani, start the hydrogen economy or something like that, right? So it's we're going to stop this, replace this. What's the core issue that everyone cares about? It's jobs and the economy. And there's some really good papers. But I think several groups have done. I think BZE's done one just about the potential for hydrogen export economies, for example, that could be simply set up in those places, subsidised with some of the money that's been used to subsidise the fossil fuel industries to get them going. And Bob's your uncle. Once the community's got buy-in, then they've got jobs, they've got an income, and it's got a future as well. I think that it does get really difficult when you're talking to people who are entrenched in their sort of beliefs, and it becomes sort of dogmatic, and you're the opposition. And like when I spoke at Sunshine Coast, I was asked how pretty much have I got any relationship with XR, and if I said if I did, then suddenly I would have been written off from that meeting. So and now in saying that, like every opportunity to educate the public and talk to them about the future and the threat, and say, look, these are opportunities that we're getting denied because a bunch of basically rich coal owners, are profiteering from it and want to continue to do it for as long as possible and drive the political agenda. It's not like every farmer that I met, for example, everyone gets climate change, like every single one, because they're seeing it as a lived experience on their farm every day. It's just whether they are somehow holding onto a belief it's a random fluctuation that will return to some normal. Almost none believe that anymore. So there are allies everywhere. And even in difficult places such as, we went head to head with the forest industries in the early days, we had to provide an alternate economic model for that community, and that was tourism in our particular area. So the default in my mind anyway is to look at that sort of renewable energy, hydrogen type export economy stuff and use that as if you're talking to those people. But if they don't even get climate change at all, like deny it, like maybe pick the next person, knock on the next house. But yeah, everything matters as well. And sometimes you get random campaigning can elicit, interactions with people that you just don't expect. So, I remember the Moss Cass was talking about the very first environmental legislation passed in Australia under the Whitlam government. And apparently the reason it got passed was the daughter of the defence minister said, "Dad, if you don't pass this, next time I see you will be when I'm standing at your graveside," or something like that. So, it's just those sort of random links that, so you might be door knocking on someone and then that person gets it. And the thing is, as we know with COVID, why it's not just a leveling thing. If you're a person that wants to make a lot of money, you can't make it in a world that's collapsing, for the most of us. Maybe if you're selling food or something, you'll be rich. But, COVID's shown that states of chaos just aren't good pretty much for anyone. The economy shuts. So it's a tiny proportion of the communities. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Maybe I can.
I think if I can jump in, I think that there's something to be said about budgets and about bottom lines. And I'm yet to meet a councillor that says that they don't care about the budget. And really, if you're able to convey what is happening from an environmental sense with the actual bottom line impact to the budget, I think you'll probably be able to talk to any councillor. If you look at some of the large scale power purchase agreements, where you see councils going off and buying renewable power, I mean, they're cheaper than the current tariffs that the councils are on. If you're looking at doing energy efficiency measures, LED retrofits, those sort of things, they've got a payback, they've got a return on investment, they save the council money. You look at things like procurement, even procuring recycled content. I mean, if councils are sending recycling to facilities, if councils are then buying back materials as part of that, it's providing demand, and so then they start getting more money for their recycled content. You've got this. There's just so many examples where the finance system is now so heavily linked to environmental benefit that if you can make those cases, even I used to talk to a lot of traders who were dead set against cyclists and were dead set against us spending money on the community for renewable power, for bulk power purchase. And so being able to explain that, if you're helping residents save money on their energy bills, that they can then spend that money in the local economy, having those sort of conversations, it just goes such a long way, and you can really tie a lot of things together, not going at it from directly from an environmental perspective.
Yeah, and I'd highly recommend, if whichever council you're campaigning for, is if you can get someone along the lines of Donovan, or one of the risk sort of council risk speakers, and I can give you their names if you want to send me an email or something. They are scary people for councillors who care about nothing other than not being sued and losing their house at some point in the future, because it's real. If you combine that with someone like the sort of thing that Sunshine Coast did, where there was a credible scientist establishing the reality of climate change, and then people talking about the risks that they face as individual councils, that's another way to get to them, as well as all the bottom line money saving items that councils can do to help the environment and save money, that you would do if you actually cared about good fiscal management.
I went to a David Suzuki lecture probably 20 years ago, and he said that this was his last comment at the lecture, and he said that he likened the human race as people sitting in a car, a group of people sitting in a car, driving out a 30-foot thick wall, arguing about at 200 kilometres an hour, arguing about where they're going to sit. In the end, it's all academic. If you're talking about budgets, it doesn't equate to what you're talking about with the other one. It can't, if you're looking at budgets all the time, which is what councils have to do, there's got to be a downside to that. And so you've got to look at population and water and all the resources and those sorts of things, and that comes into your budget. But when you're budgeting, it doesn't take in the koalas and all the habitat, all those sorts of things there. So they're directly opposed in many ways.
Well, I mean, they are if you don't factor them into your broader economic models. And so the argument for, why if the moment you put in climate impacts into the price of coal, it becomes uneconomical. The moment you put a carbon price on the loss of carbon when you log a native forest, it becomes uneconomical. It's so some of the raw environmental, like they log water catchments in Victoria, and the cost of the state is hundreds of millions of dollars in lost water production. So some of that material is out there, but the problem is they don't care really at the bottom level, a lot of them, because it's about the political influence and political power. So you need to, in my experience, it boils down to, campaigning ultimately boils down to votes or money. And you're either hurting corporations or benefiting corporations, or taking votes away or giving votes to the politicians. And there's, the merit of argument and all that sort of stuff plays a part in it, but it's important to understand that some hard campaigning is needed, particularly if we're going to get everything once, which we're not. So it's strange. And it's also like the campaigning. We have people in Victoria campaigning in incredibly conservative councils, and who have not got climate emergency declarations. But it's the first time people have gone out into community talking about the sort of issues around climate and remnant bushland and everything else that they've been talking about to their community. So every single thing is a step forward, and what we don't want to do is step backwards. So yeah, that's my take on it.
And some councillors may actually have thoughts and ideas in this space. I mean, if you don't ask them and you don't try and elicit some sort of response from them, then they may just consider it as a non-issue and keep on keeping on. So it's something that if you're actually going to your councillors asking the question, you may find that some of the councils actually are passionate about this stuff and want to see action. I don't think it's everyone's got their head in the sand. I think some people are really aware of this stuff. They just don't know how.
And I don't think, don't confuse. I don't think you should necessarily hold back on your asks, right? So your asks will be like, just incorporate all of the environmental damage into sort of basic economics. That's fine. You just have to link why you would do that to what the person cares about, if you want them to care and act on it in a sense. So is it because they care about it because it's the only thing that's going to save their grandchild into the future? Or is it they care about it because they don't want to be recorded in history as opposing a climate emergency declaration? Is it because they want to be recorded as passing the climate emergency? There could be any number of reasons why they may support something that you've got to try and work out. So part of an art of convincing someone to do something is to find out what motivates them, not you, and convince and link what you care about into what they care about. Does that sort of make sense as a general strategy?
Can I put a question? When it comes to motivation, it's when you look at the fact that 28% of CO2 emissions are by China and 1% by Australia, and every 16 days, China emits more carbon than Australia does in a year, how do you get a person who thinks about it, well, what if Australia went all out in everything we could, how is that going to balance what the Northern Hemisphere is doing? Because our contribution is so much smaller to that.
The per capita report increases enormously.
Yes, but when you look at it on the overall CO2 generation, because of course we're going to lose out when it comes to per capita.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What was your name?
Sorry.
Sorry. Look at your pen.
Mm.
You hold it.
Yeah.
Where's it going?
I don't know, my daughter gave it to me as a gift.
Well, it's all in China. This chair is made in China. That notebook is made in China.
Mm.
Most of the things we consume are made in China.
Yeah, but that's not
Most of
the
the
point, is
things
it?
the
Because
rest
that's
of the
what we're
world
given to
consumes
buy.
is made in
The
China.
issue is
Yeah,
we've all
okay.
got to do something.
Yeah, but
So can I just interject for a bit?
100% no carbon.
So
right?
if someone runs that, so that sort of is a sort of, why should I bother bailing the boat when there's 20 other people not doing it sort of argument.
Yeah.
If you did that, there's a huge chunk of the world that makes up the rest of the emissions outside of China and US, etc. So it would mean France wouldn't do anything, and the UK wouldn't do anything, and Ireland wouldn't do anything, and so on and so forth. And the reality is we're one of the richest countries in the world that has benefited the most from fossil fuel extraction in terms of our wealth. And we have actually a huge historic debt to pay back by acting and doing the best we can. And the fact that no one else is doing something is not a reason to not act. But if that's what's stuck in their head, then it's probably one of those people that you just need to sidestep and move around and work with someone who can get beyond that. Because when someone runs that argument at you, it's really an excuse not to do anything rather than an excuse to do something. Because China, other than, working out, putting a trade embargo at our end, which we're not going to do because we're a high polluting country, or personally boycotting Chinese goods, which I do because of the Uyghurs, etc. You could do a campaign like that, but the point of doing a campaign like that when Australia, per head in Victoria, we are one of the worst emitters in the world. You're saying bad Chinese people, but here we are in Victoria, being one of the high emitters of CO2 in the world.
But if you can't come up with an argument, what I'm getting at is you can't come up with an argument that is going to address what those figures and get those people on side, we're still going to be a minority, aren't we? Because you've got the majority out there. Sorry?
What he's saying is go and
Yeah, I know, but
persuade
if
someone
you
else.
can't come up with some sort of an argument or plan to get those people to rethink in a different way, you're leaving the majority of the population behind in reality.
No, I don't. Look, I've spoken to lots of people. That's not a majority position in general. I mean, people are, take farmers, for example. They're quite keen to not have climate change occurring because it's really wrecking their ability to produce their food. And they can see the writing on the wall some farms have already failed in the most marginal areas. And, people like apple growers in Victoria, there's a minimum number of frost days you need to set your apples for your particular variety, right? And farmers have in their sort of growing sheds and things, the record of frost days of each year for their particular property, and they're going down and down and down. And eventually that line crosses that minimum number and their entire orchard is gone. It's worthless. It doesn't make apples anymore. So don't look at the negatives. Just get out there and have the conversations. I mean, Queensland is probably genuinely a bit behind everywhere else. I acknowledge that, but you just got to give it the go. And the problem is at the moment, COVID's the big issue, and we've got to get out there and cut through. Yeah, eventually there'll be another set of fires and another flood and more storms, and it will be so horrendous that we won't be campaigning. It will be like you can see it in the sometimes when we do climate emergency declarations and they're opposed by the Liberal National Party aligned people, they're not always members. I've seen it in some people's eyes. They are literally feeling sick as they vote against the motion, right? Because they know on a deep, deep level they are doing something really wrong and they're going down, whether it's for their kids or history or whatever it is, they are looking sick. So you're not going to win them all, but we just got to keep pushing. And every push matters in all parts of Australia. It's part of getting the change and the change in attitude across the entire country. And most people at some level are on our side. Like the vast majority of people get climate change, they get the threat of it. At some level, they're probably denying it, but if you can get just having the conversations and showing to people that it's okay to talk about it and okay to campaign on it, helps legitimize action and, you know, raises the flag in front of all your state, federal, and local politicians at the same time as you're doing your local council campaign. You're just raising awareness as well. Dale, have you got a throw in there?
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand the question. I mean, I guess it's sort of, you know, knowing that we've probably got a decade to act, knowing that, you know, the reef's going, that koalas could be functionally extinct, you know, knowing that there's all of these environmental problems that we face in the world. It's sort of like the question is, you know, we've got to at least stick our flag in the sand and actually do something about it. I mean, you can sort of fight and argue with the people that don't want any action, or you can try and work with the people that you might be able to get a progressive compromise going. And that's why I really encourage you to have those conversations, even if you do, you know, feel that you come away and you're not feeling like you're really getting anywhere. I think every conversation matters in this space, and I think even if you're introducing some of this content to people for the first time, it's all worthwhile.
Renee's got a question. Yep.
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking of another creative angle to that Chinese person, and just there is the fact that, like, if we leave all the CO2 in the ground, you know, people can't actually burn it. So, you know, part of it is actually not selling it to China, and, you know, we're the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world when it comes to greenhouse gas potential through exports. So we're actually right up there when it comes to exports, if you factor exports in. And if we just leave it in the ground and don't sell it to China, then that's a good way. It's just another creative thing you might want to use sometimes.
I think we'll have to make that the last question, Adrian.
All right, well, thanks very much, everyone. And I might just share my screen again very quickly. So just remember that, you know, all your councillors have phone numbers, and, you know, it can be just a hand. I mean, Dale made a point in an earlier conversation, you know, sometimes, what was it, something like, you know, if a councillor is wavering on something, if they hear from you, you might be the person that puts them across the line. So good luck for the campaign, and hopefully you guys don't get the Delta variant spread, because who knows when we're going to get out of this lockdown. And I actually caught COVID the first time, and my lungs still burned from it. So I've got some sort of long haul. So I highly don't recommend it. And that was the first version. So thanks very much for having us, and see you when we can see you.
Yeah.
And thanks to all the people who came online as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Very grateful. Thank you so much.
Right,
A lot of information there.
Cheers.
Yeah, and if anyone needs to get in contact with me, my preferred method is a warning text with a phone call coming after. So, and Dale, do you have a preferred method of contact?
Shoot me an email, and we'll book in a time and we can chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll say good night, and thanks, Will, for organising it, and thanks for everyone coming.
Thanks, everyone.